The title of this work is called the Voorloper, and the Voorloper has two contexts. Historically, during the Great Trek, there was a position held by a boy who walks at the foremost part of the team of draft oxen in order to guide them, and so he would walk ahead of the oxen, and he would act as a scout, and that is one of the translations which Voorloper would be. The direct translation would be sort of one who walks ahead. The second context, which is, I suppose, what this character that we see is more focused on, is the traditional Cape minstrels. Um, and there's a festival that happens every single year in Cape Town where there's a massive street procession and the Cape minstrels, which are different groups of minstrels, perform. And this has really been a long tradition in Cape Town. I will not go into too much of the history about the Cape minstrels themselves. They do come from the days back in slavery, but today they have transformed into something a little bit different, and it's quite a big tourist attraction. They are known as the Kaapse Klopse. There are many names for them. But so this character in particular, which is the Voorloper, is one of the main characters in this procession, because he walks ahead of the procession, and he dances and he does special sort of sporadic movement, and he really sort of like rallies the troop and the crowd of onlookers. Um, and so he really has the sense of power to sort of influence the rest of the crowd, influence the troop of minstrels that are walking behind him. And we see this also as, throughout history, where you've got, the court jesters, clowns, comedians, where they actually use humor as this power to influence. And so I just found this particular character really, really interesting. I'm going to go around the body, or I'm going to go around the border of the painting, because there's quite a lot of information here, so I can't get into everything, but I'm going to go into as much as I can. The words over here is maravilla. Maravilla means marvelous in Spanish. It's the name of one of my favorite boxers, Sergio Martinez. I was actually watching a fight, or listening to one of his fights, while I was busy painting this. So I just put it down there, and I really like the way the word looks itself. Below that, we have uh, the words here saying, against the camel's mane, use tar, against poverty, make a trip down to the Sudan. And so this is an old Arab saying, which is really referring to the wealth and the natural resources that could be found in Africa. Um, the Arabs of the time referred to Africa, or at least the top half of Africa, as the Sudan. So what this really meant was that if you want to get rich, if you want to build your wealth, you should visit Africa, because Africa was renowned for its amount of natural resources. Um, Below that, I'm going to just zoom in over here. We have the words once again, which I've mentioned in some of my previous paintings, and he seems to be this reoccurring bad guy that I focus on. And it's not even a conscious thing, he just seems to pop up through this body of work, which is King Leopold II of Belgium. So I put him over there, and then I add the words at the bottom here saying die slang. Die slang actually means the snake, so referring to him as a snake. I would research him once again to find out about his role that he played in the Congo Free State, and also the information that he was given to other European powers at the time. One of the things that they were doing was they were sending in so-called missionaries under this guise that they were coming there to spread Christianity, when in fact it was not Christianity that was being spread to the locals at all. It was to actually create and establish a colony there, and then to extract all the natural resources. So that's really why I added this words in the slang, or the snake. We have here again words that are used quite a bit in some of the other pieces. Buana, King Buana. And Buana, once again, is this word that he refers to a sir or master or boss. I found this originally in a book, a graphic novel from my childhood that I received a box with all loads of my old childhood comics and books, and this book was in there. And this book was called The Hurricane Novel of 1966. And it's really like a boy story book where they've got all these different adventure stories. And in there, they have this great white explorer who goes into the deepest, darkest jungles and he explores. And he's got this sort of posse of African savages who are accompanying him, and they call him Buana all the time. And for the context of the times, that was, to to have that book at that point, nothing would be wrong with it at all. Even the illustrations, the way that African people were portrayed, it would be nothing at those times in those contexts. But if you look at it today, it would be a very different reaction to that. Next to that, on the right hand side, we have this musket over here and the words, "The Pauper, the Prince, ugly but lovely." And so, The Pauper and the Prince, of course, comes from the book, which is The Prince and the Pauper by Mark Twain, which gives an account of, these two young men or two boys in London. Um, and what I found quite interesting with this was I was thinking about how power can change a situation between what would be considered, the haves and the have-nots. And so I thought that, I was playing around with this idea of how power, as symbolized here by a gun, um, really refers to this contrast between two very different social statuses in society. Um, and below that, I put the word here, ugly but lovely. And that refers to a tattoo that I found on the torso of an image on about the gangs in the South African prisons. And this is quite a common um, words that come up. Many of the inmates have this tattoo as well. So I just married those two together, um, and they are also related to another painting that I will be doing. If I move over here, we have the words Hottentot Slave Bones, and below that Prestwich Memorial. And Hottentot Slave Bones is it's really referring to a burial site in Cape Town that was found a few years back in, I think, the early 2000s. And so during the 17th and 18th century, it was actually a Dutch Reformed cemetery, and some probably 2,000 unmarked graves suggested that it was used for the burials of slaves, sailors, poor people, and also the indigenous Khoi. And so I think it was it was in 2003 or 2004, construction was being done for this luxury apartment block, which is in a road called Prestwich Street. And this is in an area called Greenpoint in Cape Town. And then the bulldozers, they unearthed a bunch of bones and skeletons, and the excavation was actually halted, and archaeologists from the University of Cape Town was brought in, and it became a national heritage site. So that's quite an interesting. I would probably encourage people, if they want to find out more about it, to Google Prestwich Memorial, and they can actually visit it as well if they are in Cape Town. On the right of that, we have words here which says Squalid sitting on 90, empty pockets surrounded by dogs, we poor but rich. This comes from one of my poems that I wrote, and this is really regarding a specific drug which is called known on the streets of Cape Town as Mandrax, and this was flooded into Cape Town in the late 80s and early 90s, and it caused an epidemic of drug users. It's still used to this day. Mandrax, or as it was known, Quaaludes, is a drug that was created, I think, if I'm not mistaken, or manufactured in India, and it was really used firstly as a sleeping tablet, and once brought into South Africa, it was then used as this drug um, by many people on the Cape Flats, and it's quite a cheap drug as well, and so I think it spread like wildfire. Um, Moving on from there, we move to the right hand side of the painting where we see the words "the loud silence in the room." This is just sound bites that was taken from something that I was listening to at the time of painting this. Below that, we see Southpaw and Orthodox and these two arrows, and this is referring to this guy over here, who is Sergio Martinez, the boxer, and Southpaw and Orthodox is really different positioning in boxing, whether you are left-handed or right-handed, um, and that's how it actually affects the stance that you'll use when you are boxing. So this really refers to him. Words below that is red conch, which actually comes from the book of Malcolm X, and greaseball dynamite. Below that is referring to the use of African hair products to make African hair appear more smoother, or to simulate sort of whiteness, to have sort of straight hair. A lot of my work deals with that as well, about these products that have been specifically made and then used in the African community, as well as all to sort of simulate whiteness. Below that ties in as well, which is a Caucasian voice transplant, and what this ties into one of the other paintings, which is A Stairway to Heaven, where they talk about white ache. And I really came up with this concept where it's about, when you're growing up in South Africa and you're a person of color, and you suddenly find yourself in the company of white people, suddenly will change your voice, your accent to fit in, and almost as in to put you in a different social position by changing your accent. And yeah, I think this is something that is um, it's funny um, within the so-called colored community. We often make fun of ourselves about this, so we make fun of other people when they do this, but it is something that is found quite often within the colored community. Um, Below that is the words Jerry's Driving School, and this is actually just paying homage to um, a driving instructor that I had, who taught me how to drive, who has since passed away. And as you can see, like, these two are actually listed because they are part of, that's number 55, that's number 78. So they are actually part of a wall feature in another painting, and I'll link to those paintings, and probably make a video about those paintings in the future. And moving down over here, we have the words Mr. Misidentified. And once again, this is really a bit of tongue-in-cheek, because it's referring to the old 20 Rand note, the old currency of South Africa, which was supposed to have a picture of Jan van Riebeeck on it. And some people know about this and other people don't know about this at all. But the man that is actually on this note is not Jan van Riebeeck at all. In fact, it was apparently a balls up when they created the note. It was taken, the image on there was taken from a painting. And so they made the mistake of putting the incorrect person on there, and the picture, or at least this image, belongs to somebody who they think his name was Bartholomeus Vermeerden, who was a Dutch man, but the painting was of him, And so we had all this currency that was circulating around South Africa, and it was not related at all to anybody such as Jan van Riebeeck. Um, Below that, we have the word just saying Ethel Lake, and this was once again a very sort of popular spot when I was growing up, where lots of street activity happened. It was a shop, and the shop was a local neighborhood shop, and it was always getting targeted and robbed by criminals. They would do often do stick ups here as well, and so it was an area that you were told to avoid at all costs. Moving on here, we have across this character, we have the words vroeg rijp, vroeg vrot. What that really means, it's a translation from Afrikaans, and it translates to early ripe, early rotten. And this really refers to, for me at least, when I put this down, there was talking about like the tempo of ambition. So when historical figures in history have been sort of deluded with power and trying to quench it really quickly, and then it all goes wrong. And we see this people like Adolf Hitler. We see this as well with people like Napoleon Bonaparte, where they rise to great levels of power, and then they come crashing down, and they are sort of just brought down to humility. So that's the reason why I added this um, on this area over here. And then finally, on this side over here, we have the Eye of Solomon. And the Eye of Solomon here is referring to the Eye of, refers to King Solomon. I'd once again Google that if people are unfamiliar with that. And I got that out of some text that I was reading at the time, and I just took that piece and I put it down over here. Um, and on top of that, we've got one bullet, one merchant. This comes from a chant that was used during the mid 90s, where a vigilante group called Pagat, which is an acronym or stands for People Against Gangsterism and Drugs. Um, they started a campaign to target the local drug merchants. The community had been really, or had really gotten tired of drug abuse and gangsterism within their areas, and so they formed this unit, this organization called Pagat, and they went after various heads of gangs. And I make reference in another painting um, about Pagat and about one of the gang leaders that was killed as well. So that's why this is added in over here. And then just above this, we've got the last piece of this painting, which with the lines, and I've removed some of the text here as well. It says here, so precious was the tower, and then it says DE, but actually what it's supposed to say is deemed, that God struck its people with confusion. And so what this is actually referring to is the Tower of Babel, and this is a reference that I found, um, and it talks about the confusion that God struck the people with after they had built this tower to go all the way up into heaven. And I reference the Tower of Babel quite a lot. One of the other paintings that I've done, which is called Lost in Translation, this is part of that painting, which features the Khoisan woman Kritoa in there, and also a bit about the city of Babel and about language and about translation. And so this also ties into the other painting, which is called A Stairway to Heaven, where they talk about uh, a fictional leader building, a fictional leader which comes out of the book of Wizard of the Crow, which I reference in one of the other paintings. And they talk also about this building a staircase to heaven. And so I tie these two in because they're quite similar, a tower all the way to heaven. And it really talks about this ambition of man, at least trying to take on God or trying to reach God, trying to go all the way up there. And so I just find it interesting that God strikes them with confusion by giving the city of Babel, we suddenly gives them all different language so that they cannot understand themselves. They cannot communicate properly with each other. And prior to him doing this, it was said that there was a universal language where everybody spoke one language. And so this ties in quite a bit with my theme once again for this body of work. Thank you for listening.